Hi, I'm Matt Ellefson, founder and CEO of Survive It, and welcome to Fearless Friday. Today, we're honored to have a very special guest, Dr. Fred Ashbury, and he has a remarkable set of credentials, but what's most important is his knowledge and work with regards to precision medicine, and that's going to be the area of focus today. Precision medicine is less about the averages of certain small groups and more about the individual and treating the individual and their specific type of cancer all the way down to a molecular or genomic level. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Ashbury today. Dr. Ashbury, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Matt. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, can we just start it off with, a lot of people have never heard of precision medicine. So what would be your best explanation of what precision medicine is? And more importantly, how does it differ from today's standard of care, which is typically chemotherapy and radiation?
Okay, I would probably start with the second part of your question first, in that historically what we've been doing when we've been developing treatments for cancer is we look at those treatment options that are possible for groups of people. So we get results like 65% of people will benefit from this treatment, a combination of drugs or surgery or radiation, depending on the cancer and its stage. And so a reasonable question that I think people can ask is, if 60-some% benefit or 80% benefit or 40% benefit, why is it that everyone doesn't benefit? And what we've come to learn is that one size does not fit all. So you and I are unique individuals, and it's understandable then that our cancers may have unique properties, even if we're diagnosed with the same cancer in the same part of our body. And so what precision medicine has come to focus on is the uniqueness of it, and in particular to look at the combination of attributes, things like what genes might be driving your cancer versus the genes that could be driving mine. What are the environmental factors that might influence my participation in treatment, or even how I may have got the cancer in the first place? And similarly, looking at lifestyle factors that can influence treatment and or participation in care. So knowing that one size does not fit all has led to the idea that we will focus on things that will be tailored, if you will, to the individual. And in order to be able to do that, we've moved beyond the traditional testing that's been done to identify cancers and focused on tests that, for instance, look for genomic mutations.
How, you mentioned that finding specific abnormalities in an individual person and focusing on those. How do I find out if I'm a new cancer patient, how do I find out if there's targeted therapies available for me? Do I need to have some testing done? What's the process with that?
Yes, you will need to have testing done. And this is referred to as genomic sequencing. So in lay terms, I would describe it as a gene or genes that have gone wonky and are driving your cancer, either to continue to grow or certainly not to die, or environments that it creates so that the cancer can survive and continue throughout our bodies. And this is where the problems really arise, is when cancers spread. So genomic testing is done by taking a sample of the tissue of your tumor and looking at it to see what genes may be driving the cancer. And these tests can focus on certain specific genes, albeit we're recommending that you have a fuller gene panel done, such as that might be done in a large NCI Comprehensive Cancer Center, or Foundation Medicine is another example, or Guardant looking at circulating tumor DNA, that look at large numbers of genes to try to identify any of the possible genes that could be driving the tumor.
A lot of patients that we mentor and that we help they often will say, well, I think my doctor sent my biopsy to their lab and they tested for it. And hospitals, primarily in a community cancer setting, do they test for a full panel, or what would typically happen at a community cancer center?
I'd say more typically in the community, they do not do these large panel genomic tests of people's cancers. With respect, I think in the community, you have local reference labs that you can be using, and they'll test for certain genes that might be commonly known in cancer. So by way of example, if we think about lung cancer, in advanced stage lung cancer, we'll look for ALK, ROS1, EGFR, BRAF. We'll look for PD-L1 gene expression, but we won't commonly look for other things beyond that. One of the reasons for that may be the absence of access to a lab or knowledge of a lab that would run a more comprehensive panel. The cost of getting these tests done might be conceived to be prohibitive, although we recently have just seen that CMS has now said that stage 3 and stage 4 cancers can have next generation sequencing reimbursed. So this will change, I think, in my mind, it'll change what can happen in the community as awareness of that expands, and hopefully quickly. I think it's also possible that in the community, there may be a difficulty in determining if there is a gene that has caused a cancer and there is not an approved drug to treat that. It might be commonly amongst the community oncology practitioners that they would say, well, if it's not covered, I'm not going to be able to recommend it, or if I don't understand the science behind it, or if I don't have tools to implement the treatment or monitor the treatment because I may or may not be as familiar with it, they will fall back to standard of care. And again, this isn't to slight what's happening in the community. It's simply that their practice would be standard of care is what guidelines tell us to do. This is new science, and so it would be much less common.
I have been living with cancer for over 8 years now, and I've had several modes of treatment. I've had several recurrences, 7 to be exact, and each time I've had a recurrence, depending on where it is, if it starts to become what we would call progression, the cancer is moving on in a much more aggressive manner, and my current medication doesn't seem to be working well anymore. Oftentimes, in my case, and in many cases, patients will develop a resistance, or their cancer will develop a resistance to that medication. And then what happens is you start to see progression. At that time, I've always had another biopsy. And I feel that it's really important because your cancer does change over time, and it can develop resistance mechanisms to certain drugs. Can you touch on that a little bit? Why it's so important to rebiopsy?
Well, one thing that we've learned, if I can kind of put it by an example, is to say that with the primary cancer, let's say that the genes driving that cancer and that cancer itself would be considered the parent cancer, the first cancer, the primary cancer. And it spreads maybe to other parts of the body, perhaps first close by, as we know, and that would be, say, the children of the parents. Those children will actually look different genomically than the parent does. And similarly, if it spreads to other parts of the body farther away, the grandchildren, if you will, those cancers will look different from mom and dad, and they'll look different from grandpa and grandma. And this is much like we would see that our own children look a little bit different than we do, and their children look a little bit different, and so on and so on. So as the cancer does progress, we need to get on top of it by understanding and by resequencing, if you will, that biopsy to see what the genomic drivers are of the children's cancer or the grandchildren's cancer and so on. Otherwise, we would be treating only against those genes that were in the parents and missing a real opportunity, and life-threateningly missing that opportunity for people that have more cancer in other parts of their bodies.
When you have a recurrence such as this and you have progression and it's moved to a distant place in your body, it's metastasized, how do you request that to your doctor? Because it isn't a common practice today for doctors, especially at a community center. And I don't know why, but it just isn't. They don't go in and rebiopsy and do sequencing again on the tissue. And, you know, not only do genomic sequencing, but send it off for a full panel so you really know what's going on. Because oftentimes, if you're only doing genomic sequencing on, let's say, 5 types of different genes, because those are the most common and those have an approved FDA treatment plan or drug attached to them, you're going to miss. Oftentimes you aren't going to find the gene that you're looking for. And I know it's really difficult for patients to understand that and understand that their life depends on having this test done. And so we default to authority, which in this case, you know, as a doctor, we rely on he or she to know everything they're supposed to know and do the right things. But unfortunately, there are so many of them that aren't doing the right things. They are not testing for a full panel. What do you recommend that a patient do? I mean, should they be very, very serious and very adamant about getting this testing done?
In my mind, I would insist. If I'm the patient and I know my cancer is spread, I would insist in speaking with my community oncologist, I want this test to be performed. And for some of the reasons I mentioned before, it might be that the oncologist doesn't understand it. This science is changing rapidly. It might be, as you've mentioned already, the absence of approved drugs are only for those genes that are known. I can give you an example of a person recently where in her advanced lung cancer, they did not test or would not routinely test for ROS1. She did send away for a full panel. It did return ROS1, and now she's doing quite well on the inhibitor for that gene. So that would have been missed. In other words, she gone along with what she had been told by her physician in that setting, then they would have missed that. They would not have tested for it, and her life, in my mind, would have been in jeopardy. I think it's also fair to say that the cost of this has been a factor in the past. I believe that's changing with the new CMS ruling that stage 3 and stage 4 cancers can have full next generation sequencing reimbursed. So that will open up the opportunity. But I would encourage anyone who's has a diagnosis of cancer to open up the dialogue, be strong about that in the conversation with their oncologist to have that sequencing performed and repeated if the cancer does in fact spread.
You mentioned a couple of times CMS, and just so that our audience and our users are aware of what CMS is, it's a Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and it is a federal program. Many patients, particularly of the elderly age, are on Medicare. And up until this point, Medicare was not paying for genomic sequencing. And they just approved that last Friday. And so that is a great step. That's incredible progress moving forward. It is so important to really get to get to the point of at the genomic molecular level of your cancer and your cancer cells and your cancer genes that are driving the cancer. Because without that, you're just guessing. And we don't ever recommend anybody allow their doctor to guess with their life. It's your life at stake. So you want to do everything possible to try to attack specifically what's driving your cancer. Now, Dr. Ashbury, a lot of doctors I've talked to will argue that, well, there's no sense in testing a full panel because we don't have any treatment options for some of these rare genes anyhow, so why test for it? What would your answer be to that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is the more that we know, so from just the advantage of having the information about what the genomic drivers might be, this might allow for some focus being placed on those genes that other companies will develop drugs for or treatments for to attack those genes that are driving the tumor. So knowing that is helpful from that perspective. And secondly, I think very often as we're understanding more the pathways of these genes, that it's kind of like thinking about it as a series of genes along a pathway that you might not get the treatment specific to that gene that's driving your cancer, but you might have a treatment for a gene further up the pathway or farther along the pathway that can go a long ways to inhibiting the progress of that cancer as well. So I would encourage both from the patient's perspective as well as the clinician's perspective, doing the full sequencing. Otherwise, we simply don't know anyways what the options could be for treatment. And I'd rather not guess to the extent that that's possible.
Yes, I agree with that as well. And I also feel that as a patient, if we still want to know what gene is driving our cancer, even if today there isn't a drug or a clinical trial to target that specific gene. At least now we know what to watch for. And we can set up a Google alert for that gene and my type of cancer. And as soon as a clinical trial, as soon as any research, as soon as any content is written whatsoever about that particular gene, it will send an email directly to you. And we'll show you how to set up a Google alert in the comment section below. Also, I feel that it's also important. You know, I've like I said before, I've had doctors that tell me, well, it doesn't really make any sense to do a full panel because we can only treat, you know, so many genes anyhow. Well, how do you ever discover other genes contributing to cancer if you only test for what you already know about? You know, and that has always been a thorn in my side when I hear that answer, because I know in 2010, when I was first diagnosed, their panel at that time was around 40 genes. They were testing for 40 genes, and now they're testing for over 400. So, and that continues to grow every year, the amount of genes that they're finding that are contributing in some way to cancer. And as you mentioned before, excuse me, as you mentioned before, some of these genes that are considered rare today, they're considered rare today because doctors aren't testing the full panel.
That's exactly.
Now, if they tested full panels, they may not look all that rare anymore. There may be a lot of people that actually have that gene. And at that point, then the pharmaceutical companies are going to start pouring money into research for solving or finding a targeted therapy for that, what was considered a rare gene and no longer is a rare gene. And people like yourself know that. People in the industry that study precision medicine and genomic sequencing and how important it is to treating cancer know that. But the rest of the world doesn't, unfortunately. Do you think that's going to change? What's it going to take to change and make that commonplace?
Well, looking back historically at the number of changes that we've seen in terms of getting new policies in cancer care and treatments in cancer care visible, Well, I can certainly say that the scientific community and clinicians have worked extremely hard, as hard as they can at least, to bring forward new options for people to have better outcomes. I would say that the single biggest driving force that will change policy and practice are patients and patient groups. No, not excluding the fact that there are hardworking people in other communities, including the scientific community. Patient groups like your own are going to make that agenda stronger. If I look back 25 years ago in the uptake of breast cancer research, this wasn't because of very good researchers and clinicians working in breast cancer. They played a role, but it was women, their partners, and others who took up the cause for breast cancer, drove to Capitol Hill, wrote letters to their politicians, dug their heels in the community that got it up to the forefront, and why we have the differences that we have been able to make in breast cancer. So it's people like you, Matt, and your groups that are going to make that difference. Let's push it, and I do believe that it will in fact happen sooner than later. The more that people become a part of this and can embrace it and work to do something about it, the better it is for everyone. And trust me when I tell you, the clinical community and research community appreciates that support because they haven't been able to do it on their own.
That is a great point. That is fantastic. Let's move on to something a little bit different, and that is falls along the same line. But if I'm a patient with late stage cancer, stage 3 or 4, especially if it's metastatic and very difficult to treat, there may be an approved targeted therapy available to me, and I'll be on that therapy for a year. Some of them seem to last a little bit longer, some of them a little less. But let's just say, for example, I'm on it for a year and it stops working. I've developed a resistance. Now, my oncologist, who I love, who is doing their very, very best for me and looking out for me at my community cancer center, has kind of run out of options. They don't know what to do. Now, at this point, we always recommend at Survive It that patients seek out a qualified second opinion at an academic research center that is doing research on their specific type of cancer. How do you feel about that, and why do you feel that's so important?
Well, first, I agree with a second opinion, even on the first pass around, if you will. When you're told that you have an invasive disease like cancer and that it's more advanced, I think it's wise for you to seek out a second opinion right out of the chute, if you will. And certainly with patients, if their cancer's spread, to get that kind of additional expertise. My experience is that most community oncologists don't discourage people from getting a second opinion. I often think that it's patients who can believe that it's inappropriate, it's impolite or something, that they should be asking their doctors for that other opinion. That for some reason their doctor, she or he, may be upset with them about it. I don't find that to be the case. I'm sure there have been instances of it, don't get me wrong, but I believe that if you're forthright with your oncologist and say, you know, I would really need your help in reaching out to someone who's an expert in this area. Even if you offer to help with that process, is there anything that you can do as a patient? What can you do research on in terms of who the leaders are in this space? Turning to organizations like Survive It and others who might have a cadre of experts whom they might be able to list and recommend that others can seek. But I do think that bringing it up to your oncologist is a very good idea. I think that oncologists should be asked and encouraged to reach out to experts in the field to get other opinions of that, what else can be done. I think many of them try to do that anyway. I think it should be possible to reach out to multidisciplinary tumor board type teams. That is multidisciplinary, by which I mean they might be focusing on radiation oncology, medical oncology, surgical oncology, supportive care aspects of treatment, and so on. And have that community oncologist connect with one of the large centers and present a case to tumor board, or at least have the case presented on her or his behalf to the tumor board for advice. So I think there are things that can be done, but I certainly would encourage people to ask, not be discouraged or feel that they would be putting their oncologist in a bad light because they're seeking out another opinion. It is your life, as you said earlier. It's important to take charge of it. I would tell you that, and this sounds like perhaps a horrible way of saying it, but I think people put in a great deal more investment, for instance, into doing research on what their house would be like, or a different model of car would be, and the features that they want to have on that car, or going to Best Buy to research what a TV would be and look at a Best Buy comparison chart, than they do by going to their oncologist, and they just kind of turn over control to that person. I think you do have to take ownership, but I also do feel that most would be receptive to, I need you to seek outside assistance to help in my case. I think my case is something that it's important to me, and it's important to you and me for me to be successful. I know you care about it as my oncologist to get me the best possible outcomes. So whom do we need to contact who's the best or among the best in the field to help?
That is a great way to put it. I really like that. It's a very, very strong and powerful explanation. And I do feel as a patient, I that's the way I live, and the way I face cancer myself is I take responsibility. I become engaged. I set up Google alerts, and I read and I learn as much as I can about my cancer. In fact, it was just a little bit over a year ago that I had terrible progression on a new drug that I had been taking, and it wasn't working right. And I was in the hospital, and I even had doctors come in and talk to my wife and I about hospice. And I said, no, I'm not ready for hospice. I was aware of a drug that wasn't approved yet because of my Google alerts and because I was actively engaged, but it was in clinical trial form. I didn't have access to it. The trials were not open at that time, but I did know about expanded access through compassionate use. And so I did ask this was at a community cancer center. I asked my doctor to apply for compassionate use of this particular drug that I needed, and they did so. And I was, a lot of people think, well, that's going to take a long time to get approval. I was on that drug within 10 days after seeking approval to my doctor. Can you explain a little bit about expanded access and compassionate use, and why that is so important for people to know and at least have that in their back pocket?
I think in a lot of cases where there are novel agents that are being developed, new drugs that are being developed and might be in clinical trials, it's good to seek the advice of your oncologist if your options have run out, if you will, as a result of developing resistance to the current medication that you've been given. However, that's not the only option that exists for patients, as you've mentioned. If the trial isn't available to you in that cancer center, and you're not able to go to the cancer center where that trial is being offered, ask your oncologist, and your oncologist will likely get the assistance of his pharmacist to reach out to the drug company and to seek support from the drug company for compassionate use of that drug so that you can in fact get access to that drug. This happens a lot more than people may understand, probably because they're not aware of it, they don't ask for it. But I can count a dozen times in the last 2 weeks I know of patients that have been able to get access to the drug because they've gone forward to their oncologist and said, is there a compassionate use option for me? And what needs to happen to follow through? It usually means filling out some forms where the oncologist has to explain the cancer, the treatments that have been given up to that point in time, why she or he is recommending this drug. And it's possible that in the case of the pharmaceutical company that might be developing that drug, that they'll seek additional information too, want to review information about the patient, because they want the option to be offered in a situation where it's fair to the patient, where she or he has the most possible benefit from that drug. But to your point, this doesn't often take weeks and weeks or months to get done. It can take days or a couple of weeks to get done, as long as people invest the time on it. And I think, again, my experience in the community setting is less are familiar about doing this, fewer patients are familiar about doing this, and we need to make that message clear and strong for them. And that in the community setting, because you often shop with your oncologist in the same places, or you could see them on the street, or you meet them someplace, there's a different kind of relationship that's possible. And I think that those folks would work hard on your behalf if they know that you're interested in pursuing that. I think sometimes too, oncologists may feel that, you know, by offering up these options, maybe they're building our hopes up beyond what is reasonable. However, I think that's not their decision to make. I think it's a conversation between the oncologist and the patient about what the goals of treatment are and what these other drugs that might be available can do in response to those goals, and then roll up your sleeves and do the work.
Excellent. And I agree with that entirely, especially the last statement about the oncologists making that decision on their own, that they didn't want to get, you know, provide false hope. I hear about that often, and it just really angers me, because that decision is not theirs. And I'm going to tell you, there are so many people that we've mentored that have been in their final days of life, and they aren't well enough to get on this other treatment plan, and it's too late. And they're in their final days of life and regret. And there can't be anything worse than regretting an opportunity and not being allowed or provided that opportunity. And I know firsthand, if I know that I have exhausted every opportunity available to me, and I'm in my final days of life, I'm ready to go in peace. You know, I'm a very strong faith. I've done everything I can here on earth. I've tried to heal my body as best I know, together with my medical team. And now it's time for me to go, and I go in peace. But it's the regret thing that that is the most fearful and stressful thing that we all fear that would happen. And so it is really, really important to do that. Now, one last thing, when we talk about clinical trials, sometimes patients may not be well enough, or for whatever reason, it might be financial reasons, it might be responsibilities they have at home, but they can't travel a long distance for a second opinion. And many cancer centers have remote second opinions available today. Can you explain a little bit about that and why they're important?
Well, when you look in most US states, a high percentage of people don't live in cities. They live in rural or more remote places. And therefore, you know, have long distances to travel. I'm a farm kid, so I can tell you that, you know, if you looked at how far it would have been to go from farm to hospital for treatment, and you're in the middle of, say, calving, or you're in the middle of harvest and you're told, well, you'll have to go for 4 weeks of radiation treatment or multiple weeks in the infusion suite for cancer therapy, it's very challenging in and of itself, let alone getting access to clinical trials and support where you live. So now with telemedicine and other electronic health type services, this can really support people who are farther away from urban and suburban centers where they can get access to cancer treatment and cancer clinical trials. I think they're hugely important given the distribution of patients. We don't all just live in all the big cities where all the big cancer centers are. So we need to have access to these technologies and these services that exist. And we know of some in different parts of the country that are available. And it's just up to us, I think, to make that information known to community oncologists, where those services do exist, how they access them, how the patient participates in that, and so on, in order to improve access, and so that patients get the best available options for